Hey, I'm Eric,
Hi, I'm Zarinah.
and we are going to talk about Covidiots today. So, Zarinah, what do you think about bad people?
Well, I don't know. I don't think bad people exist. I think we have people who are created and behave in ways that their environment sort of nudges them to do. And most humans, I think, are capable of performing a range of different things under different circumstances. And I think, when we perform badly and we do something harmful to society, I think we tend to blame the individual rather than look to the circumstances that created that individual and led to that act. And, I think acts, whether they're like positive or negative, should be seen as the end of a very long trajectory of events.
So we are products of our environment, in other words.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, of course, nature has a role to play as well, like our genetics is there, but I think humans are very adaptable, plastic species that seem to be able to behave in all sorts of different ways. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that humans can be different kinds of actors under different kinds of circumstances.
Have you heard this term Covidiot? Referring to people who basically break the rules of shelter in place?
Yes, it's horrible. It's a horrible term, full of moral judgment and failure to understand each other.
Yeah, I think that's something I really would love to dig into, is like where this outrage toward other people sort of not behaving the way they're supposed to comes from. Because I think, the standard sort of explanation for the term is that, here we are, all of us, in this really difficult situation together, and the people who sort of violate social distancing put us all at risk. And, I think there's probably an element of resentment there, which is that, here I am suffering under shelter in place, not seeing my friends and family, not going outside, whatever the rules might be in your locality. And there that person is violating them and making it, first of all, enjoying themselves in this way that I don't get to. But also, there's an aspect of, the more that people violate these social distancing norms, the longer we're going to have to suffer in our sheltering in place. So I think that's the sort of standard story about the term. But I wonder if there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally understandable that people feel upset at other people under this situation. Our entire future depends on how we act as a collective. It makes a ton of sense that we're under extraordinary stress and looking to sort of police other people and make sure that our individual acts of sacrifice and good behaviour, which are meaningless alone, are not sort of being negated by our neighbour. That totally makes sense. So I think what's tough is this sort of projection that other people must be stupid or morally depraved, when in reality it's likely that everyone has completely different access to information. We have the information bubble, the information war is no doubt to blame for a lot of this, as well as the fact that people have just got really different tensions, struggles and motivations. Like it's super easy for a lot of people to shelter in place, but if you're not able to pay your rent, it's not really sustainable. If you're maybe in a terrible situation at home, or God knows what's going on, and I just think it's a complete failure to understand the struggles of others.
Yeah, I think the lack of empathy piece is an important one. I have a slightly different take on it. I think that's definitely true in a big way. It's definitely the case that plenty of people just have lack of access to information. Folks might not quite understand the issues involved, but actually I think there's a breakdown in our commitment to each other. So one of the implicit critiques that exists in this, call out of people breaking social distancing norms is the demand that people be these good citizens. And it's framed in this sort of responsibilized terminology. And it makes me think a lot about sort of what it means to be a citizen under neoliberalism, where basically you have economic logic determining everything. And under these circumstances, you can't expect citizens to be citizens in the classic sense of, defending common public goods, debating in a public, collective sort of political sphere, and those debates being about the common good, right, and how best to manage it. What you have instead, and this comes straight out of Wendy Brown's book on neoliberalism, Undoing the Demos. She says what you have under neoliberalism is a new kind of citizenship that is all about responsibilities and not anything to do with sort of perks or the state side of the social contract. So we have this social contract with each other as citizens that we behave in each other's best interests because it's better for us all to do that. But neoliberalism does this thing where it undermines the sort of mutual benefit of collaborating, right? So suddenly we all become these sort of entrepreneurs of the self in a sort of giant marketplace, competing with each other constantly. And that super undermines the ability to be a good citizen, right? To be good to other people.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a huge issue, which is basically that like citizenship has been degraded enormously under neoliberalism. And then here we are. So this is the other side of what she says. She says we still are expected to like tighten our belts when the economy is bad, right? To sacrifice, our jobs if we need to, sacrifice in all sorts of ways, even enlist in the military if we need to. So if there's some version of citizenry left, it's like this shallow patriotism.
Yeah.
But so all these sort of responsibilization discourses are still circulating around. And so under these conditions, the best you can do, if you're one of those people who still get something out of society, and generally that's like privileged people, right, who still have something to gain from people all cooperating. If you're poor and everyone cooperates, it still fucking sucks for you, right? Now, granted, we're in a situation where, our actual health is on the line, though it's, try explaining social distancing to someone who's still going to work every day at a grocery store or whatever, or a warehouse. But we're in the situation where, the privileged people seem to be looking to all these folks who basically have no commitments to society, and they try basically because these people don't have an internal motivation to cooperate or participate in society. And what we do is we try to fall back on social shaming in order to accomplish what commitment to each other as citizens is failing to do. So anyway, I know that's a long-winded explanation of how I've been looking at this stuff, but that's how I see it right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have this sort of terrible thing where we, as individuals in America, in an individualistic society, we have all the responsibility and none of the autonomy or none of the agency, right? So like suddenly that everybody was looked to as individuals to try and figure this out before the government, way before the government, in order for tens and hundreds of thousands of people not to die, people had to figure this out before the government. It's been very slow to respond, and still is slow to respond. So our current strategy isn't going to get us out of this. It was an emergency strategy and it should have been deployed for a period of time, but we need phase 2, right? We can't just keep doing this. We need some like next phase, and the government still hasn't done that.
Yeah.
And so it's still on individuals to be thinking about how to deal with this. And I think people are under an extraordinary amount of moral fatigue, where every day they're weighing up their actions and trying to work out, how many people are going to die because of this, and how do I keep my family members safe, and every moment of every day everybody's having to sort of make these like really complex moral equations in their sort of like day-to-day lives, which I think just does not allow for us to understand what's going on for each other, and I think that's really, really stressful. It's setting us against each other in a sort of really sad way, and I think we should look to countries where they have not done this, but they've done some completely different strategy which didn't require authoritarianism and didn't require shaming, and also people haven't died,
Right. So things like contact tracing and other sort of state-managed mitigation strategies, which have
not state, right? So I think like a lot of what happened in Taiwan was decentralized participation from citizens who just had good experience about what to do and sort of got on with it.
I think the state has been this the state is a different thing in different contexts, and I think in some of these places the state has been it still functions, at least in some ways, as this collective utility that serves the benefits of all.
Yeah.
And it seems like this is something that we've totally lost track of in American and maybe even British society, although you all still have the NHS, but we no longer think that the government can do anything. And I think this is part of where this outrage comes from, is we know deep down that basically we're in this on our own, and there's no one coming to save us. And so therefore it's all of our eggs are in the basket of everyone needs to behave as these good citizens and behave themselves.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think people are still operating as individuals in a collective rather than a collective. People are still sort of operating, like the mass exodus from the cities, people who can work from home, working from home, sort of pointing fingers at people who can't really work from home. Nobody's really thinking about where they lie in the broader context, and how their individual actions are maybe impacting people who are in a different set of circumstances to them.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really tough. We just don't have a good sort of modern class awareness, if you like.
Did you see the sort of luxury or elite quarantine stories about how wealthy people are going to their country homes to hole up for they're basically just on perma vacation taking their banking work there or whatever, they work from home,
which is great. I just wish everyone could do that.
Of course, same.
It's it's a wonderful thing that some people are finding peace and freedom from all sorts of regulations over their sort of bodily autonomy and time frames and day to day. But I wish everyone had that. Lots of people just having the exact same life that they had before. Right.
There's that expression that when, in times of crisis, we pick up whatever ideas or concepts or sort of zeitgeist is laying around, and unfortunately, it seems like the dominant zeitgeist with respect to dealing with a crisis has been this sort of the sort of prepper, get your shelter and your guns, zombie apocalypse is coming, that sort of that mind state has sort of framed how we've dealt with this crisis. It's not surprising to me that we've been so individualistic in our responses to it. Although then there's this weird side of then demanding everyone else behave themselves when we're stockpiling and holding up in our houses. Yes,
I think I saw the zeitgeist defined nicely on Twitter as the scheitgeist recently, which I think sums it up. I think there were examples of this not happening, right? So the community houses that we reside in have behaved a bit differently, and I think are looking after each other. I think outside of those it's probably even worse. I read an article about, I think it's 1 in 10 people in the UK is living completely alone. Wow. Completely alone for whatever it is now, 12 weeks.
Oh, it's horrible.
And that's just devastating. And they were this is solitary confinement, we can't cope, and of course it's just absolutely terrible. And
there's study after study that shows what solitary confinement does to people, right?
Yes.
And there's a whole skin hunger thing,
terrible. You don't have
even touch for a really long time. You were telling me about that article where somebody said, I haven't hugged anybody in 10 weeks or whatever it was.
Yeah, I've heard people saying I have to log out of Zoom calls when I see people in a close proximity like this because it's too upsetting. It reminds me of friends who've said that they can't stand it when people post pictures of their babies if they can't have a baby. It just feels like a really poignant absence of a thing that you want.
The conservative response to this would be, well, then everyone should be part of a nuclear family. You're supposed to be living in nuclear families. You're not supposed to be single forever or supposed to be, out there doing your own thing. And I feel like what we've been trying to explore in the communes is a sort of more collective vision of shared life. We agree, we agree with Aristotle, who thinks that man is a political animal, right? We can't just do this on our own. We we're a social species. We have to live these negotiated shared lives. But we've tried to do that in a way that's more intentional and less top down than the sort of nuclear family template, which we're sort of all expected to fit into. We've tried to create our own version of family and our own versions of collective life, shared life.
Yeah, and I think it's worked very well. On the whole, if you look at the people who are in community houses, they are thriving. There's definitely a sort of class element there, which is that
all the wealthy people fuck off.
Well, no, that a lot of people in community houses tend to be people who can work at home. It's not entirely true, but generally, because they have strong existing relationships, high confidence, lots of like ecologies of care, and they were early adopters. They are able to physically distance in groups. That means that they're not socially isolated. So, there's a lot of financial solidarity and stuff like that. But, I think for people who are, some people who have completely been alone for 2 months, and then some people who are quarantined with people who are their abusers, or like, not people that they would like to be quarantined with, they've got a completely different battle to face. And I think we really need to like be less judgmental about what everybody's motives are.
Right.
And be thoughtful about what kinds of information they're processing. Our access to sort of neutral information is all but like disappeared these days. There's
been this discussion of sort of trying to enter into like sort of like pods, or like where you're basically sharing a safety sphere with other people, right? So you basically try to all be in the same sort of band of risk, and then you make shared agreements about, here's our cleaning protocol, here's like our policy on visiting with other people outside this household, here's our grocery policy, all these things. And so each community house seems to have written a document that actually explicitly addresses all these agreements, which is really interesting. So here you have, the social contract reemerging in these sort of parallel institutions. Conditions where it does enable you to be a good citizen. I think that's really amazing. One of the things I wonder about and worry about with all this, though, is as you mentioned, so many of the people living in our collectives that we're familiar with, they are able to work from home. But how does this work? If you're sharing a pod with people who work at the grocery store, or who are more working class and therefore less protected in the shelter-in-place guidelines that basically treat working class and poorer people as disposable for the benefit of everyone else.
Well,
how do you build sort of safety conditions and shared agreements involving those folks? Yeah,
I think so. What I see happening now is that various pods are forming with different sets of agreements about what's acceptable in those pods, and those account for essential workers or people that work in places that are high risk, and also trying to account for people who can't tolerate any risk at all. So what I think we saw in the early stages was, every human for themselves. What am I going to do? I need to get to a safe place. Do I have my needs met? Do I have all the toilet paper in the world? Okay, so we in the individualist mode times 1,000. And then, at least in our sort of community world, you saw that sort of like pop into the sort of bubble, so that you started to see agreements being made within your house or your community. There's a little bit of a shift, people moving around, but by and large, each of these sort of bubbles has like started to self-form into a stable place.
As people shift to communities that maybe are more appropriate for their needed risk levels.
And there's been quite a lot of movement, and not without tension, but that's stabilizing. So these bubbles are sort of stabilizing.
Yeah.
I think the problem is now that each of those community houses has adopted a level of individualism, which is like, okay, well, we're okay, we've got all the food we need, we've got our shared agreements, and of course that's natural, but I think the next phase is like, okay, we are part of a multicellular organism, how is everyone else doing, who's missing, who hasn't got anyone, how do we make sure that we go out into the streets and we leave bags of food everywhere, how do we make sure that people who are living alone know that they're seen, and so on and so forth. And I think, the mutual aid groups have been extraordinary in this. The problem is I don't think... What's your favourite quote? Can you say your quote, your Foucault quote?
It's been posited that, people don't know what it is that they're doing. And this is sort of the ideology, the idea behind ideology. So Foucault says... people do know what it is that they do, and frequently they even know why it is they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they're doing does.
Right, and I think this is the problem. We don't understand the impact of what we're doing, and in an individualistic world, that just isn't going to work well for us. We don't have a good model for, like, what kind of, am I a worker bee, what kind of bee am I in the swarm, and have we got too many of these kinds of bees, and are my kind of bees looking after those kinds of bees? And I think that doesn't make for good sort of collective well-being, collective health. So I'm hoping that we're going to start to see this happening. Like I think it's been very clear that we can't rely on the state to come up with good plans for our futures, and we have to do that ourselves.
But ourselves, you mean as groups, really?
Yeah, as citizens, as participants in the world, like, what is it that we're all crew on spaceship Earth or whatever, and
Well, some of us are crew and some of us are flying first class.
Well, yeah,
on
but
this
but,
particular vessel.
Yeah.
Some of us are in the engine room.
It's just the engine room.
Feels like.
What am I saying? So I think as participants we have to figure that out, because I don't think the state's going to fix this for us. I mean, of course, we can hope that they catch up. But I think we need to create a sort of like class consciousness about what our doing does.
Yeah.
Like as people like disappear out of the cities that we ourselves have gentrified. What does it mean to leave now when it's really in a time of crisis? And what does it mean to go and take this time to go and spend 3 months in your blah 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 retreat, or of course that makes sense on an individual level, but that's going to be tough on a group level. Actually, maybe it's not, right? But I think that conversation's missing, which is like
totally. What can I give?
Yeah. So an interesting thing would be like, okay, 20% of the population have to move out of the city because like their mental health is going to necessitate it. So let's be strategic about this and make sure we crash house prices, and then like there's people to sort of buy land and put it into trust. Like there's all sorts of ways that we could still have the things we need, but collectively be thinking about how we come out of this stronger, rather than has completely fragmented individuals who have all run for the hills. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that does demand, and I think this is possible, it does demand that we break out of the sort of subjectivization that that neoliberal sort of governance has put us all into as sort of entrepreneurs of the self, or just looking out for our own interests. As you're speaking just a moment ago, I was thinking about how when the outbreak first occurred, we know plenty of young, healthy, perfectly fine people whose immediate thought was, how do I get the hell out of here and secure my own safety? And it's tough because that makes sense as an individual. You just want to protect yourself, but it seems like the best way forward is to try to think about who has health capital, who has financial capital, who has all these different forms of ability to sort of tolerate adversity in one form or another. And how do we sort of work with that to sort of make a more fair, inclusive, and safe place for everyone? And for some people that might look like tolerating more risk to exposure to the virus, for example, because you're young and because you're healthy. I mean, I think this is part of the reason why we view, and rightly so, those people on the front lines, the essential healthcare workers, as sort of heroes, because they are tolerating risk and for the sort of collective good. And we don't tend to have those same narratives for Amazon workers and store clerks and so forth, even though they're clearly essential. They're not paid like essential workers, but they certainly are for all of our benefits. So anyway, I don't mean to constantly make this about class struggle or whatever, but I wonder, in the collective, whether being a good citizen is actually being able to tolerate, if you're a healthy young person, being able to tolerate more risk by having someone in your household, or multiple someones in your household, who work in grocery stores, who work in hospitals, and being okay with that, rather than, okay, well, now anyone who works out in public and is exposing themselves to the virus, now they have to live alone, isolated somewhere, for the next however long this thing lasts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to poke holes at any actions anyone's taken, but and I know that's not the intent here in general. There's a strong argument to be made that just dispersing might help slow the spread, and that and that might be true. We might come to realize that the best thing we could have all done was fled for the hills. Who knows? But I think the point for me is that the conversation's missing. Right.
About what is the best thing for everyone.
What should we be doing as participants of this planet? Now we're a social species with a social disease. What are we going to do? And
this goes way beyond just social shaming as individuals, right? The responsibilized individual.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a bit of a tragedy, but I also don't think it's too late, right? I think it's been a very fast evolution. We've gone through personal crisis, and then sort of local crisis, and we've stumbled and built like really extraordinary things. Like I've been very moved by how much caring's going on and how much organising's going on, and everyone's trying desperately to heal from the sort of like collective trauma of all of this, as well as build at the same time.
Yeah.
It's only been a few months, but I do think that going forward over the next 6 months, we need to come together and be like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to value different kinds of participation in the world that maybe the stimulus checks aren't going to cover? How are we going to make sure that we come out of this to a world that we consent to, not just that we all sort of come together to look after each other in this moment of crisis, just so we can go back to the sort of abusive situation that we had before.
Right. Abusive is a good word for it. For me, this is actually where prefigurative politics have a place, which is that you do, I think, need to give people a sort of glimpse of what it could be like, but you also need to reactivate those collective concerns for each other. And I think that doesn't come from nowhere. And I also don't think it's going to happen at a national level. I think it needs to happen at a more local level. And so I think it starts with, okay, me and the 10 people I live with, we look out for each other. And ideally that can aggregate outward, so we start to look out for more and more people. Because if you haven't experienced that sort of social solidarity, the sort of like communism of the household, right? You're never gonna have it anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so it seems really important to sort of start with that as a building block. And here I'm aware that like this sort of mimics conservative social theory, which is that the family is the building block of society. You can't have a civil society without family building blocks.
I mean, I think they're very different, right? One is saying you can choose your family, you can choose your people with whom you're going to build your life in solidarity, and the other one's saying, you have some romantic connection, and there's just sort of one way. There's, like our romantic relationships are just sort of formed in this one sort of like quite
determined.
Over-determined way, and once you've sort of opted in, that's sort of it. You're either, so you're sort of stuck in it, or you have to go and be alone for some time. There isn't like the fluidity that you have with other kinds of social formations.
Totally.
You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to go to Berlin for 6 months, and that's okay. Like often in our traditional families, that's like not okay. And so an over-rigid, over-determined social formation, I'm sure, is as bad as none for some people.
Sure. Yeah, I think where it really differs from the family, in my understanding, is that you start to form alternative institutions, right? It's not just a group of people just trying to get each other's back and maximize the like wealth in that place. They're in the best, collective situations, you don't totally disengage from politics, right? The sort of exit, exiting or withdrawing from, mainstream political society, you only do that in order to stage a much more effective challenge to what exists. So your exit doesn't negate your voice, and so you're engaging exit and voice at the same time. This is what we call engaged withdrawal. So by withdrawing a bit, you're able to create alternative institutions that then actually offer alternative visions to the existing set of institutions. So it becomes these collective households, unlike a family, which is nothing like this. They become these institutions that actually have agency over the system, right? And that feels really important and really worthwhile. And so if you add to that this picture of sort of renewing our commitments to being citizens in a much more egalitarian and empowered way, I think you have a really powerful challenge to this sort of very narrow sense of the responsibilized, entrepreneur of the self that neoliberal ideology sort of creates as a proxy for citizens.
Right. Yes. So Eleanor Ostrom's work looked at how social norms can encourage collective action choices that serve a group, and in some of their work suggested that public policy being based on these rational actor economics of a previous era are likely to be preventing us actually from developing the social norms we need for collective action. So, the theories out there that suggest we can do better. There's for sure there's empirical examples of humans doing a better job. I just think we haven't gotten to the place where this is like public knowledge, that there's a sort of understanding that this is something that's like internalized in most people. I think for the most part people still think humans are selfish and will operate according to local needs, unless you sort of like sort of find them.
It's no wonder people think that either. I was just reading this Civilized to Death book by one of the authors of Sex at Dawn, where he points out that, all kids are basically exposed to like children hobs when schools assign them the reading of Lord of the Flies.
Yes.
And every school child reads Lord of the Flies and then walks away from that thinking,
Yes.
yep, every human is this selfish person that really needs, strong guidelines for behavior.
Yeah, and then did you read the article that about the real kids that were stranded on an island?
Right, and it was like a veritable utopia, and they totally took care of each other.
They totally looked after each other, and it's extraordinary that we've taken someone's sort of depressed depiction of humanity and used that to sort of seed the rest of us.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really hoping that our sort of next sort of phase of like cultural imagination helps us get into a space where we're not just we're not just doing horizontal communalism where we sacrifice the individual for the group, and we're not doing individualism where we look after ourselves at the expense of the group, but we're doing something else, which I sort of refer to as like mutually assured autonomy. Until we're all free, we're none of us free. Thinking about how do we all pull each other forward. What would it look like if the myths that we were told as children that we sort of internalized and grew up was that like unless we all win, we all lose.
Yeah.
And imagine what a world could look like if we started to develop explorations along those kinds of axes.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I feel like at the core of it is like good governance. You need good governance, and that's not people telling you what to do, but like shared agreements that we govern ourselves by, right? And at the moment, those are totally lacking.
Yeah.
And to replace them, we have these sort of regimes of social shame and condemnation, moral outrage, and so forth. And so, hopefully, we can channel some of that energy toward building better governance and better agreements and better institutions.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things I would love to close with is what you think right now people can do. Our call to action. What can people do?
I mean, I think in the short term, in this emergency moment, think about who's missing from the radar, who's alone in their apartment right now, and how do you make contact with them. And that really is probably going to be things like putting signs in your window, saying if you're alone and you need help, call me, things like that. But of course this is only a sort of short-term solution, but I think those things really matter. They really, when someone is looked after by a stranger, they'll tell that story for the rest of their life. People always sort of like recount these extraordinary stories of care. I think in the longer term, I think we need to break out of the idea that this is our lot, that this is what humanity is capable of. I think humanity is just discovering what it's capable of, and we should consider ourselves to have a sort of collective developmental timeline, and I think we need to move into the next phase, which is like how do we operate as a sort of like as a species that has an ecosystem to steward. We have to get ourselves ready to be that. We have to get the next generation ready to be that, and then we have to start exploring different visions of how that could operate.
I think this idea of different visions is super important, and I feel like we're in this time where right now it's like a really great time to be experimenting. I feel like there's three main things we can do doing right now. One is to experiment with alternatives. That might be a small thing, but just like change the aesthetics of your life, change the way that you relate to people socially, shift the sort of the daily patterns, the way you relate to time, to space, right, to other people. That's the sort of prefigurative layer. You can just like, we can't imagine an alternative when we continue living in this sort of old way. So even small adjustments can actually shift us out of this sort of impasse or aporia that many of us find ourselves in. And one step up from that, I think, is making demands. And those demands should be rooted in a belief that like we can have something drastically different and drastically better. Here the state has been making all these demands of us, and we demand nothing in return. I think it's time that we make huge demands of our states. These are collective institutions. They should be able to make fantastic things possible. If we all pool our resources and energy and effort, if the government if they just barely tried and just said, how about on Sundays, everyone gives 2 hours to like build something awesome for their community together, right? You would have immense collective wealth in that small act. but we just don't do it. And so I think thinking outside the box about like how we could make better demands of our political establishment is a really worthwhile exercise. And then the last one, and I think this grounds it all really, is imagining major different worlds. And I think science fiction is really amazing here, utopian fiction. And also aesthetics and art. I mean, these are all ways of imagining how things could be totally different.
Yeah.
And I think all three of those layers are really important right now. And I think so. We've been working on this organization called Beyond Return, which is trying to intervene in all three of those levels. And we will link Beyond Return's sort of entry portal for anyone who wants to get involved with that. But it's a generally post-capitalist project that's seeking to build better and brighter futures on the other side of this. The idea being that we can return to a much better normal rather than continue to suffer this degrading, embarrassing, really, reality that we've been stuck in for so long and been told that there's no alternative.
Yeah, and if you are looking for inspiration or ideas, there's plenty on the website.
See you there.